Emma woke up early in the morning from a barely audible sound. Somewhere outside the window, the first spring birds were singing, and the light sunlight, breaking through the translucent curtains, softly touched her face, as if reminding her of the inevitable beginning of a new day. She was in no hurry to open her eyes, allowing herself to lie half asleep for a few more minutes, enjoying the feeling of safety and warmth emanating from the familiar bed and from the quiet breathing nearby. Dan had not yet woken up, and this knowledge calmed her, gave her a feeling of home comfort that seemed eternal. For Emma, their life was moderately measured and harmonious every day, like a calm river flow, without sharp turns and surprises, but with a pleasant depth and stability that she valued. The room was filled with the subtle aroma of freshly baked bread that Dan usually brought home in the morning from a small bakery not far from their apartment, and it was one of the few small rituals they maintained together, despite the busyness and hustle of everyday life. Emma rolled over and glanced at her watch. It was almost 7 in the morning, and ahead of her lay another workday full of meetings, calls, and plans. Her mind ran through her to-do list. Call her mother, check on Laura, check the mail, pick up papers for work, stop by the store on the way home. Inwardly, she felt that all of this was a familiar part of her life, a foundation on which her confidence in the future was built. Over the past years, Emma had learned to appreciate exactly these little things, ordinary moments that might seem routine to others. For her, they were support and a sign that the world was not changing too abruptly and chaotically. She had once thought that happiness was something grandiose and exciting, but now she understood that it often lay in the quiet and smooth flow of life between two people who had managed to create a shared space of trust and support. Dan, her husband, was not very talkative, but always reliable, patient, and calm, like a quiet harbor where you could hide from the storms of the outside world. Together they saved money for their own house, a small dream that they built brick by brick, slowly but surely. Emma's family life was almost perfect. Morning breakfasts, when they discussed plans for the day together, evenings with a cup of tea and a favorite book, weekends filled with walks and meetings with her parents and younger sister Laura. Her parents were her support and example, and Laura was both a close person and a mystery. The younger sister was lively, emotional, sometimes too impulsive, but deep down, Emma knew that it was her spontaneity that added warmth to their family circle. Although the relationship with Laura was not always simple, sometimes there were misunderstandings and minor conflicts that were quickly resolved, thanks to the mutual desire to maintain the connection. For Emma, family meant not just blood ties, but also a set of daily manifestations of love, in care, attention, shared experiences, and small joys. She was not a person prone to excessive emotions or drama, rather, practical and rational, able to see things as they are, without illusions and rose-colored glasses. Therefore, it seemed to her that everything was fine and calm with them, no reason for anxiety or doubt. Every evening, when she closed her eyes, a picture of stability and harmony was drawn in her head, where she, Dan, and Laura calmly walked along a road, paved with mutual understanding and trust. Emma loved this coziness, which was created not only by the walls of their apartment, but also by every little gesture, every conversation and look that formed the overall pattern of their life. She knew that happiness is not always bright flashes and loud words, but often a quiet confidence that there is a person nearby with whom you can share both joys and difficulties. This was her strength and support, and she was not going to change this order of things. In the end, an ideal life is not ideality in itself, but the ability to appreciate what you have and take care of it, no matter what. A few weeks had passed since the usual. Even silence reigned in Emma and Dan's house, which, it seemed, nothing could disturb. But barely noticeable cracks began to appear in the familiar facade that they had built together for so long. At first, these were small things, barely noticeable even to the most attentive observer. Dan began to stay late at work more and more often, although before they had an unspoken agreement to spend evenings together, discussing the past day and making plans. His phone suddenly turned out to be too important to leave it in public access. He began to hide the screen from prying eyes, and when Emma accidentally caught a glimpse of a flashing message, she put her thoughts aside, not wanting to give vent to doubts. All this was so unusual that Emma's heart began to squeeze with anxiety, but she tried not to think about it, convincing herself that it was just a tense period at work, that Dan was tired or needed time to sort out some problems. She did not want to destroy what seemed so stable, their world, where each other's every step was understandable and predictable. Her trust was like an invisible thread that connected them and kept them in a comfort zone. But with each passing day, this thread became thinner, almost transparent. In addition, a new, unusual detail recently appeared in their life. Laura, Emma's younger sister, unexpectedly asked Dan to help her with repairs in her apartment. It would seem that there is nothing unusual. The wife's brother and sister are relatives. Supporting each other in everyday matters is natural and logical. However, something flared up in Emma's soul that she herself could not immediately explain. A slight embarrassment, anxiety without obvious reasons, which pulled her thoughts in the direction of fears. It seemed to her that there was something hidden in this request, something that went beyond the usual family mutual assistance. But in her mind, she quickly drove these feelings away, repeating to herself that there was nothing between Dan and Laura except family ties and good intentions. She tried to find justification for any of her doubts. Maybe Laura really was in a difficult situation and needed help. Maybe Dan just wanted to be useful, nothing more and nothing less. Emma understood that her role was to support the family, to remain calm, to create an atmosphere of trust and understanding, because this was the basis of her relationship with Dan. She was not prone to dramatization, did not like to inflate mountains out of molehills, so she diligently suppressed all disturbing thoughts in herself, considering them groundless. However, with each passing day, she increasingly caught herself noticing strange little things in her husband's behavior. Once he forgot to say where he was going after work. Another time he came home late, avoiding conversations and evading questions. This was not the usual open closeness to which she was accustomed, but a kind of barrier that separated them from each other. And although logic told Emma that these were only temporary difficulties, her heart felt alarm, a quiet, persistent signal that something was wrong. Things were not so simple with Laura either. She, usually bright and open, suddenly began to behave differently. She avoided frank conversations, reluctantly answered questions, and something new, elusive appeared in her gaze, as if a secret hidden from everyone. Emma tried to talk to her sister, to understand what was happening, but Laura avoided answering, changed the subject, and this only increased her anxiety. Each such attempt became an attempt to penetrate the curtain that was falling ever more densely between them. A conflict was brewing inside Emma. On the one hand, she did not want to destroy the established picture, preferring to believe in the best. On the other hand, doubts and questions were growing that required an answer. She understood that these signs could not be ignored, that their family peace, and perhaps much more, was at stake. At times she caught herself thinking that trust is a fragile thing, easy to lose, but very difficult to restore. And while she struggled with internal contradictions, the days passed, and uncertainty and tension increasingly penetrated her life, reminding her that an ideal life is not always what it seems at first glance. There was a special atmosphere in her parents' house, as every year on Christmas Eve, when family traditions intertwined with a subtle expectation of a miracle, creating an indescribable comfort and warmth that was like a shield from all adversity and doubt. But this time, something in the air seemed tense, as if before a thunderstorm, invisible but anticipated by everyone in the room. Emma watched what was happening, feeling a strange mixture of feelings that defied simple explanation. The joy of meeting, childhood memories, echoes of family love, and at the same time a quiet but inexorable feeling that something was about to change. A family dinner brought everyone together. Parents, Laura, and of course Dan, who for the first time in a long time looked tired, but somehow focused. He was sitting next to Laura, and this circumstance, which had previously seemed natural and innocent, now caused Emma an inner anxiety that gradually turned into an insurmountable burden. Conversations were unhurried, laughter interspersed with memories, and the smells of traditional dishes filled the room, creating the feeling that everything around seemed to have frozen in this festive moment in order to give everyone the opportunity to forget, at least for a moment. But it was at this moment that Laura suddenly stood up and, looking at everyone present, made a statement that seemed to strike like a bolt from the blue, causing everyone's hearts to tremble with shock and incomprehension. She announced that she was pregnant, and the father of the child was Dan. These words hung in the air, heavy and deafening, destroying each of the familiar edges on which Emma's reality rested. The moment seemed to stretch out into eternity, and at that moment each member of the family faced a choice: to accept this news or to reject it, to try to find an explanation or to drown in resentment and pain. The parents' reaction was restrained and at the same time unexpected. They did not express surprise or condemnation. Rather, they showed calm understanding and support for both Laura and Dan, as if they had known about what had happened long before this secret was revealed. Their words, full of acceptance and care, seemed like a cold wind for Emma, exposing her feelings of betrayal and loneliness. She stood as if on the edge of an abyss, feeling how her former world, so dear and stable, was slowly crumbling into fragments. Emma's internal state was like a storm in which resentment, confusion, and bitterness were mixed. She could not understand how all these years, which seemed to her a strong union and trusting relationship, could hide such a depth of lies and betrayal. Her gaze darted between Dan and Laura, trying to find some thread that could explain what had happened, but she found only emptiness and silence. Her heart sank with the realization that the betrayal came not only from her husband, but also from the one she considered a close and beloved sister. The words spoken that evening were like hammer blows on glass. They shattered everything that had been built up over the years, leaving Emma alone with her own thoughts and feelings. Her parents, calmly accepting the situation, did not notice or did not want to notice the pain of their daughter, whose internal struggle was hidden behind a mask of calm that she tried to maintain for the sake of her own dignity. This moment became a point of no return, the boundary between a past that cannot be returned and a future that will never be the same. Neither side said anything else of importance, but the silence that followed the revelation was louder than any words. Their glances, full of misunderstanding and inner pain, crossed without finding a response, and Emma felt how everything around her was gradually becoming alien and unfriendly. That evening, for the first time, she felt the real weight of betrayal, not only as her husband's betrayal, but also as the destruction of what seemed indestructible. Deep down, she understood that her life would never be the same again, but she did not yet know what the next step would be. After that night, when the walls of her parents' house seemed to shrink around Emma, crushing her with their cold weight and inexorable truth, she felt the ground on which her life was built, that stable foundation that seemed eternal and unshakable, crumbling under her feet. An abyss opened up in her mind, into which all her hopes and plans, scraps of trust and broken dreams slowly began to fall. It was impossible to stay there, among those looks full of quiet condemnation and indifference. Impossible to breathe in an atmosphere where every word, every gesture reminded her of betrayal turned inside out. Leaving her husband was not an impulsive decision, but rather a hard-won act of liberation from a burden that she could no longer bear. Dan, whose face in recent days seemed both strange and familiar to her, like a mask put on a person who had long since changed, did not try to hold her back, did not look for explanations and justifications. Perhaps he had his own pain and confusion, but for Emma it no longer mattered. She packed the few things that remained for her as symbols of personal freedom and left, as if breaking free from captivity, which for so long seemed like a cozy home. Support came from her friend Carrie, a person who, despite all the storms of life, remained a beacon of common sense and kindness for Emma. In her apartment, where Emma moved for the first time, there was simplicity and order, contrasting with the chaos that raged in her soul. There were no unanswered questions, no accusations or silent reproaches. Carrie listened without interrupting, letting the words flow freely, like a river carrying away pain and resentment. These conversations, filled with warm cups of coffee and quiet night conversations, helped Emma to collect herself again, to find the strength to move on. However, the process of divorce turned out to be no less painful than the breakup itself. Endless meetings with lawyers, discussions about dividing up joint savings, attempts to agree on a future that now included new rules and boundaries, required not only legal literacy, but also emotional endurance. Each document, each signature was a reminder that the past was becoming a page that was closing forever, and at the same time, opening a door to the unknown. Emma experienced this procedure as something that broke not only material ties, but also the spiritual knots that connected her with Dan. Meetings with Laura became a separate test. The sister, who had previously been part of Emma's inner world, now seemed alien, closed, and incomprehensible. Their conversations took place in tense silence, where every word was like a step on a minefield, and neither of them could afford vulnerability. Emma tried to understand what made Laura do such a thing, how she could not notice or not say, but the answers eluded her, leaving only shadows of suspicion and disappointment. Sometimes it seemed that her sister wanted to say something, but was afraid, or simply did not know how to express what lay deep inside. Emma's emotional experiences during these months were like an endless wave, sometimes lifting her to the heights of hope, sometimes knocking her down with despair and bitterness. She felt lost and determined, vulnerable and strong at the same time, a combination of contradictions that sometimes became an unbearable burden. Every night she asked herself questions to which she found no answers. How to live on, who to trust, how to find herself again in a world that seemed destroyed and alien. In these reflections, among 1,000 thoughts and feelings, Emma gradually began to realize that the past cannot be changed, but you can choose the path to go on. She understood that her strength was not in forgetting or forgiving immediately, but in not breaking down and preserving her inner dignity. The fight for herself, for her life, for the right to happiness became more than just a task for her. The meaning of her existence, the fire that warmed her even on the darkest days. She increasingly recalled words that once seemed simple and banal, but now acquired a deep meaning. Happiness is not the absence of pain, but the ability to live on despite everything. This lesson was difficult, but necessary. And although there were still thousands of trials ahead, Emma felt for the first time that something new was being born inside her. A desire for freedom, for independence, for a life that belonged only to her. Moving to a new city was not just a change of residence for Emma, but a symbol of a final break with the past, an attempt to start life anew on a clean slate, where no one would know her history, mistakes, and pain. A new job, a new office, new faces, all this simultaneously caused her both anxiety and a slight anticipation of changes that, as she hoped, would lead to internal relief and personal growth. In the first days after the move, she almost never stayed at home, trying to immerse herself in work to drown out the silence and emptiness that haunted her in hours of solitude. The new city turned out to be completely different in spirit and rhythm, not similar to her previous measured life. But this was exactly what was needed. A space where you could be yourself without other people's looks and unasked questions. Professional tasks, although complex, fascinated Emma, gave her the opportunity to apply the knowledge and skills that had accumulated and strengthened over the years, allowing her to feel in demand and significant again. The colleagues she met were mostly young and ambitious people, busy with their own problems and achievements, so they did not ask unnecessary questions about her past, which was an unexpected and at the same time saving relief for Emma. However, despite the external calm and busyness, a storm continued to rage inside her. Thoughts of betrayal, of breaking up with her family, of how quickly the foundations that seemed indestructible were collapsing, did not subside. Every evening, closing the door of her apartment and being alone with herself, Emma returned in her thoughts to those events that turned her life upside down, remembered the faces of loved ones, words that sounded like a sentence, and the moment when the world built on trust collapsed. She understood that in order to truly start a new chapter, she needed not only to change her place, but also to find a new support within herself, to learn to trust the world and people again. The recovery process turned out to be long and non-linear. There were days when it seemed that the pain and resentment had already subsided, giving way to bright hopes, and there were moments of despair, when loneliness became unbearable and intrusive. At such hours, Emma tried not to withdraw into herself, went outside, walked through parks and streets, peering into the faces of passers-by, trying to find in them a reflection of her own inner state. She gradually learned to let go of the past, to understand that mistakes and wounds are a part of life, and not its sentence, and that it is through these trials that a person becomes stronger and wiser. New acquaintances became for her a kind of window into the world, which continued to live and develop, despite all her personal dramas. Some people she met along the way inspired her with their energy and optimism. Others became random companions with whom she could simply talk or share a short moment. These encounters, though fleeting, helped Emma feel part of something bigger, not lost in her own pain and loneliness. Inwardly, she understood that the future depended on her, and this awareness gradually restored her confidence. Distant news about her family, which sometimes reached her through mutual acquaintances or rare calls, were perceived without the same emotions, as part of someone else's life, in which she no longer wanted to interfere. Her heart, although it did not forget the pain, learned to separate the past from the present, keeping in mind the lessons and warnings, but not allowing them to dictate the terms of her new life. Emma tried to concentrate on the present, on what she could change and what she had influence on, leaving behind everything that caused her pain. This new stage was not just a change in external circumstances, but a deep internal transformation, an attempt to find herself anew, to understand her true desires and aspirations, to find meaning in those trials that once seemed endless and unbearable. Every day became a step forward. Even if this step was small and imperceptible, it was important and valuable. And in this movement towards a new life, Emma gradually found what had long seemed a lost dream: freedom, independence, and the possibility of happiness that belongs only to herself. Several years had passed since Emma had left that house and that life forever, in which she seemed doomed to pain and betrayal. And during these years, she had managed to build a new world, more fragile but honest, more open, but requiring her to constantly work on herself. Each of her steps in this new space was thought out and weighed. Each meeting and decision served as bricks from which her independence and confidence were built. However, at that very moment, when it seemed that all the doors of the past were closed, and the remnants of that life remained only in memory, a call rang out that disturbed the fragile balance, like an unexpected intrusion into a long-forgotten world. The phone call came from her mother. Her voice, soft but insistent, sounded different than before. It sounded like a request, a tone full of anxiety and fatigue, which made Emma wary. The mother spoke of Laura, her younger sister, of the illness that had turned out to be more serious than anyone had expected, of the hard times that had come for the family, of the needs of the children, who were now left with virtually no help or support. These words seemed to open an old wound that Emma had been trying to heal, awakening both compassion and inner doubts in her. For the past seemed to be stretching out its tentacles again, threatening to pull her back in. The internal conflict grew with every minute. Part of Emma wanted to believe that this request was not a lie, that the family really needed help and she could become a support, part of the solution. And the other part was afraid of another manipulation. New pain that could destroy the thin wall that she had built around herself for so long. For the first time in a long time, she felt that she could not simply brush it off and leave, not give an answer. But how to understand the true motives of those who remained there, beyond her new life, in that world that had once been home, but had now become a source of disappointment. Emma made a decision to contact those who could shed light on what was happening, who could help separate truth from lies. Calls to relatives, cautious questions, attempts to understand how serious the situation was, what threats hung over the children and Laura. The answers she received were different. Some expressed gratitude for the attention and help. Some tried to remain silent or change the subject, and some avoided contact altogether. All this only increased the internal tension, making Emma feel even more confused and helpless, as if she stood at a crossroads, where each choice promised either relief or new pain. Another link in the chain was a conversation with Dan, a man with whom their paths diverged not only legally, but also emotionally, whose role in the past remained marked by painful memories. This conversation was careful, filled with omissions and measured words, because neither of them wanted to open old wounds unless absolutely necessary. However, it was in these dialogues that Emma sought the truth, not just facts, but an understanding of what lay behind this call and request, what drives people who were once a part of her life, but now seemed strangers. Emma's soul was a mixture of feelings: anxiety for the fate of her nephews, growing caution and mistrust. the need to be strong and at the same time remain open to help. She understood that the decision would not be easy, that no words could instantly resolve the situation, but retreat was no longer possible. That call became the point at which the past re-entered her life, demanding not just attention, but action, demanding to choose a side, to understand where her place was, and how to protect those who, perhaps, still need her. Emma could not predict what trials awaited her ahead, what changes would occur in her heart and mind, but one thing was clear. Now it was no longer possible to simply close the door and forget. This call marked the beginning of a new phase, in which old wounds and new opportunities intertwined in a complex pattern, forcing her to look at the world from a different perspective, reconsider relationships, build boundaries, and search for answers that had long remained hidden in the shadows. Emma's parents' house greeted her with a coldness that seemed not so much physical to her, as it penetrated deep inside, eroding the shaky confidence she had tried to maintain over the past years. The shadows on the walls seemed longer and heavier, as if reflecting everything that had accumulated between them. Unresolved conflicts, omissions, and bitter secrets that were now crawling out of the darkness and demanding an answer. There was tension in the air, thick and almost tangible. It was felt in every look, in every breath, as if the very atmosphere of this house had become a mirror of discord and betrayal. The meeting with Laura was as cold and difficult as a meeting could be between two people. When each side carries its own burden of pain and resentment, and the bridges that once connected them have long since burned out and collapsed into the river of oblivion. Laura seemed to have changed, her eyes once bright and spontaneous now showing weariness and despair, as if the weight of responsibility and lies on her shoulders were too heavy for the young man. Their conversation began cautiously, each word a step on thin ice that could crack at any moment, plunging them both into the cold water of mutual misunderstanding. The exposure of the lies that lay at the heart of the whole story, illness, financial hardship, difficult circumstances, laid bare the painful truth that each of them had tried to avoid. Emma saw how deception was woven into Laura's words, how carefully justifications were constructed, how the fear of losing support and attention drove her sister to resort to the most desperate means. This realization did not bring relief. On the contrary, it became a heavy stone that pressed on the heart, forcing one to wonder where the line was that could not be crossed, even for the most noble purpose. Emma had to restrain herself from lashing out in accusations or reproaches, knowing that a conflict would destroy not only the fragile bond between them, but also her own sense of self-worth. She spoke calmly, trying to find words that would not hurt, but there was a firmness in every sentence, a desire to protect her nephews from the toxic environment in which they had grown up and to give them a chance at a different life. Emma knew that this statement was not just a step in a legal battle, but an act of internal struggle for the future of her children, who, despite everything, were the most important thing to her. The family dynamics were suddenly laid bare in that moment. Her parents seemed to be on Laura's side, their looks and words not hiding their support for their daughter, which pushed Emma even further away, making her feel like an outsider in her own home, an outsider in the family she had once called hers. Manipulations and attempts to shift responsibility onto her, accusations of coldness and indifference. All this was created like a thin web, from which it is difficult to escape without damaging yourself even more. Emma understood that these games were not just family disagreements, but a struggle for power and control, where the main object was the children and their fate. All this psychological tension, hidden threats, unspoken demands, attempts to evoke a feeling of guilt, was a test that Emma was forced to go through in order to declare her position and outline the boundaries that no one has the right to cross. Her words, despite her inner trepidation and doubts, sounded clear and decisive. She was ready to take custody of her nephews in order to protect them from destructive influence and give them a chance at a normal life. This statement became a kind of challenge, a breakdown of the wall behind which fears and insecurity were hidden, an attempt to gain control over a situation that had long since gotten out of control. The emotional scene, filled with contradictions and pain, left behind a silence that was more expressive than any words. Each of those present was left alone with their thoughts and feelings, realizing that this meeting was a turning point that changed everything. Emma, despite her fatigue and heartache, felt that she had taken an important step, a step towards her own dignity and responsibility, a step that marked the beginning of a new chapter where there would be no more room for lies and betrayal. Time is that invisible force that heals and destroys at the same time, stretching wounds so they can heal, or leaving scars that remind you of what was and what can never be restored to its former form. Emma stood on the threshold of her new life, looking back at everything that was left behind. Those days and nights filled with pain and betrayal, moments of doubt and struggle, meetings that exhausted and took away strength, and attempts to rebuild herself, sometimes seeming meaningless. She felt how something changed inside her, as if a part of her soul finally found the peace and freedom that it had been searching for so long. Breaking with her old family, with her parents, with her sister, with those who were once near and dear, did not come easy. It was not just a physical departure or legal registration of guardianship. It was an act of internal liberation, an acknowledgement that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let go. There was no room for pity or regret in this decision, only for a conscious choice based on an understanding of her own value and right to happiness. Emma learned to see herself not as a victim of circumstances, but as the mistress of her destiny, who is not afraid to step over pain for the sake of a better future. Her strength now lay not in attempts to change the past or correct other people's mistakes, but in the ability to build a life where she is comfortable and where she can be herself. This new stage became a symbol of independence, a reminder that happiness is not something that comes from outside, but a state of mind that can be preserved even if storms rage around. Emma felt that she no longer needed someone else's approving smile or excuses, that her inner world was strong enough to stand without relying on the past. Saying goodbye to her family did not mean hatred or anger, but rather an understanding and acceptance of the fact that some ties were broken not by the will of one person, but because of accumulated disagreements and incompatible life positions. She realized that toxic relationships can destroy not only emotional health, but also the ability to see yourself as a whole person. There was a lot of pain in this farewell, but even more hope for a new life, where she can surround herself with those who appreciate her real self, without masks and pretense. Emma looked out the window of her new apartment, where the soft evening light gently touched the walls, and felt how silence was born in her heart. Not emptiness, but space for new feelings, new hopes, and new stories. Her path was difficult and thorny, but it was this path that led her to the realization of her own strength and independence. She knew that there were still many trials ahead, but now she was ready to meet them with an open heart and a clear mind. This chapter of her life closed not with a sense of defeat, but with pride for the path she had taken and gratitude for the lessons that made her stronger. Emma took a step into a new reality, one where she was the author of her own destiny, the creator of her own happiness, and the keeper of her own world. And this was her real victory. which neither time, nor people, nor circumstances could take away.